Hello, I'm Linda Massey, Associate Director of Professional Learning at Ontario Principals Council. I'd like to welcome viewers from across the globe today, and 9 countries have participants who've signed in today to this live web-based interview with Ken Leithwood. It's the third in a series of 1-hour presentations that are being offered by International School Leadership. The webinar series itself features each of the members of the ISL's Board of Advisors. We've already had our first 2 with Michael Fullen and Andy Hargreaves, and Michael's is archived on the website already, with Andy's soon to be placed up there, and Ken Leithwood's will soon follow. Dates for upcoming sessions will be posted on the website in the new year, and you'll have an opportunity to listen to Avis Glaze, Lynn Sherritt, and Karen Edge in the next few months. Flyers will also be distributed to all of those who have signed up with International School Leadership or have registered for one of our sessions in the past. Our audience today is made up of educational leaders who are interested in hearing our guest's perspective on how they can have the most sustainable impact on school and system improvement. Dr. Ken Leithwood is Professor Emeritus of Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. He's a world-renowned expert in the field of educational leadership, with many papers, journal articles, and books to his name. My 2 favorites are Leading with Teacher Emotions in Mind and Linking Leadership to Student Learning, and I've been using them a lot in the last 10 years in my work here at OPC. So Ken, welcome back to Ontario. I know you're going to miss the sunshine and the golf courses of Florida, but you're only here for a few weeks and then it's back to the sunshine.
Thank you. Yes, it is.
Good to have you here.
Good.
Thank you.
Pleased to be here.
In early 2012, you prepared a paper for the leadership branch of the Ontario Ministry of Education, and we've sent out to our participants, and you've downloaded probably the blue copied paper here, the discussion of the research foundations for the Ontario Leadership Framework. After this session, participants will also be able to download the version itself that came a year later in 2013, the actual framework itself. My questions today will focus on the actual research paper that you prepared. Jurisdictions around the world use a collection of practices to define effective school leadership. These practices are somewhat universal in content and reflect worldwide research. In the introduction, you differentiate between practices and competencies. Why did you move to leadership practice as a key concept in the Ontario Leadership Framework?
Well, I go on about that at some length in the introduction to the research version of the framework. By the way, from my point of view, that's the framework. The rest is a summary. But to cut through to the chase, I think I was concerned about identifying the actual behaviors or actions that principals engage in when they're effective. And the idea of competencies conjures up notions like skill and knowledge, which might or might not be enacted in action. And it's also the case that most of the evidence we have about what makes a difference around school leadership is about the actual practices leaders engage in. There's still some mystery behind the knowledge and skill people possess when they enact those practices. So first of all, we're interested in the overt actions of principals, and secondly, we're trying to be very evidence-based here, and the evidence is about practices.
And in terms of the practices you describe in this document, what are those universal practices, actions, and then it's kind of moved into this idea of domains. What are these practices that are most significant?
Well, we've organized the framework around 5 practice domains in addition to the personal leadership resources. And the first 3 that you encounter when you're reading through the framework are universal in a very broad sense, which is to say you will find good evidence about the value of those practices across many different sectors on the part of leaders. They have to do with setting a compelling vision and determining the sorts of goals the organization needs to be working toward as the first domain. The second domain has to do with helping people build the capacities they need to work in the organization to accomplish those goals and to meet the vision of the organization. And the third has to do with ensuring that the organization itself, the structures in the organization, if you like, and relationships, are aligned with the goals of the organization itself. I mean, every time an organization takes on a significant new initiative, what this set of practices reminds leaders to do is make sure that people are served by the structures that are in place rather than having to fight against those structures to practice in different ways. The fourth domain, which we call improving the instructional program, is an acknowledgement that this is about leadership in schools, not leadership anywhere you find it, but leadership in schools. And the improving instructional practice domain tries to get at what we might call the technical core of teaching and learning and how leaders might go about building and improving that technical core. And then there's a final dimension that has to do a lot with being accountable for one's practices. It's an interesting dimension that's there largely because of the policy context in which most schools find themselves, which is, for the last 10 years, one that really focuses on holding schools accountable for accomplishing at least major sets of outcomes on the part of governments. It's hard to ignore that as an important function for leaders to worry about. But the evidence really is quite interesting about that, because it suggests that unless accountability demands are made in the context of very supportive environments, they make no difference to a leader's effectiveness. So an important caveat, I think, when we think about that domain.
Thank you. We have listeners, viewers, who have sent in some video questions for you as well. I'm going to move to our first video question from an international viewer. And this question is from Klaus Jordal, who's the chairman of the Danish Association of School Leaders. And besides viewing the video question on the screen here, we've also typed the question into the chat window underneath the video itself.
Hello, my name is Klaus Jordal. I am chairman of the Danish Association of School Leaders. In Denmark, we have a big reform on the school system going on these years. And we are very concerned in the School Leaders Organization about how you see on the balance between support and pressure. And my question to you is, what is the main factor you can identify in support school leaders to make the reform a success? Thank you very much.
I think one of the most important things a leader can do, and one of the most important things people can help or support the leader to do, is ensure that these reform efforts are built on a compelling body of evidence that makes the case that if you implement the reform effort in a reasonable fashion and in a fashion that's consistent with the context in which you work, you will get the results claimed by the reform itself. And I focus on this in particular because so many reform efforts in the past really haven't stood much chance of improving schools because they haven't been based in very strong evidence. They've been based in mirroring practices from other places or some kind of philosophical position to be taken about how classrooms should behave. So I think we've moved to the point now in our sophistication in school systems that we really need to be demanding compelling evidence that the reform will work. And that puts the leader kind of on the moral high ground. If the leader is able to say to staff, the government would like us to engage in this reform. I know it's going to be a lot of work on our part, But really, the evidence suggests the outcomes for kids will be better as a result of doing that. So that's kind of one answer to your question. The second answer, I would say, is providing opportunities for school leaders to sort of learn their way forward through the reform effort by helping them develop, networks among their colleagues, by providing them with opportunities to engage in conversations with people who are familiar with the evidence that I've talked about before. In other words, creating opportunities for them to become communities of learners, so that they can help understand the reform effort and what it's intended to do, and find advice and mentoring, perhaps in some cases, with their colleagues and other members of the school system.
Thank you. How does context affect our ability to enact effective leadership practices? You have a lot of knowledge about various practices around the globe itself, and of course here in Ontario. So context might be very important.
Well, if we think of that question specifically in the context of the leadership framework, as I said a little bit earlier, it's an attempt to specify effective practices. But there are different levels in which the specification could take place. So in a sense, it doesn't drill down to the level the principal actually needs to decide what they're going to do Monday morning. It still leaves the principal the discretion, and requires the principal, I guess, to figure out how they're going to enact that practice in their own specific circumstance. So, for example, if we imagine the practice of helping our staff members build the capacities to implement the reform that Klaus referred to, and you're in a school that has a large cluster of very mature teachers who've been working with the government on building the reform, that capacity development will look very different for you than if you're in a school with a group of teachers who are some distance from the reform. Perhaps they're new to the profession. There's a different kind of work to be done, even though the practice we've identified in the framework sounds the same.
Thank you. Now, in your research paper, you said there are a small but critical number of personal resources which leaders draw on in order to enact effective leadership practices. How are the cognitive, social, and psychological resources instrumental to leadership success?
I think each of those categories is instrumental in somewhat different ways. The cognitive resources are divided into problem-solving expertise and knowledge. And I think that whole set of resources aims at alerting school leaders to those elements of their school that are likely to have the biggest impact on student learning, and helps them sort of narrow their practices to those aspects of the school about which their efforts will have the biggest contribution to student learning. So especially, I think, the cognitive resources serve the purpose of allowing the principal to distinguish between things they could focus on that will make a difference to their improvements efforts, and things that maybe they have to focus on, but briefly, that really won't have much impact on their students' achievement, even though they might have to be done anyway. The social resources really get to the heart of a core, I guess, leadership core leadership skill. We might call it, it's all about relationships with people. There are very few leadership positions in the world that are more personally intense than the leadership of a school principal. They have relationships with students, with parents, with staff, with people from governments. There's members of the community, members of organizations in the community. There's almost no one that doesn't feel they have a perfect right to talk to the principal. if those relationship skills don't work, nothing works. So they are, in a sense, a building block. They're not so much what the communication is about, but they're about how that communication will take place in a way that engenders people's willingness to continue working with the principal. The psychological resources are really at their core all about motivation, especially in heavily reform-oriented environments. Attempting to do what principals are being asked to do ought to lead to all kinds of depression and giving up on the part of perfectly reasonable people. You have to be very optimistic to think you can accomplish something in the context in which many leaders work. And it's the optimism about accomplishing something that allows people to persevere long enough through the inevitable failures they'll have to eventually see some signs of success. So it's about not only initial motivation, but those resources are what sustain the motivation of people over time and through many of the difficulties that they'll face.
In the past, like the hard skills around management and those pieces were considered to be the most important. We seem to have shifted to what used to be considered soft skills in this sense. And how do you see that being enacted?
Well, we've taken a position in the framework that tries to kind of eliminate the distinction between leadership and management, just to start with that point, on the grounds that people who really seem to be good at this job have figured out how to do what some people refer to as those management tasks in a way that contributes to the goals they have as leaders of their organizations. And so it's that kind of stark distinction between operational tasks or management tasks and the things that you do about leading the school forward that we're trying to meld them together into a more integrated conception of what needs to be done. Only people in formal school leadership roles get to do many of those so-called managerial tasks, but the folks who are really expert at this job have figured out how to make use of them to at least nudge the organization forward. They approach a parent complaint, for example, as an opportunity to help in some small way share the vision the school has for the parents' students with them and to kind of enlist their cooperation in working as a partner with them in that direction, just as one example.
Do these needs carry over into the system level as well? Here in Ontario, we have the district level working in partnership, of course, with the various schools and their principals. How would we see that enacted at a system level?
Well, certainly our district level conception of the school leadership framework includes all of those personal resources. And we've added a personal resource, a psychological resource we've called proactivity. There's no reason why school level leaders wouldn't benefit from it either, but it was when we worked on the district that this started to emerge as particularly important to us. Certainly, system-level leaders have lots of reasons for valuing optimism and perseverance, and the proactivity piece really comes out of our acknowledgement that the system leader's role, in a sense, spans a larger number of people, a larger number of opportunities, if you like, probably a broader set of goals, and in being able to put aside the many different distractions that occur in the district level leader's role is part of what allows them to be proactive, or part of what it means to be proactive, kind of separating, in a sense, the wheat from the chaff that you're facing, and continuing to push forward with your improvement efforts in spite of the fact that you could easily spend 25 hours a day just on the things that confront you that you had no intention of dealing with. It's not all that much unlike what the President of the United States faces. They come to the role with a very carefully crafted platform, most of which they never get to because other events overtake them. It becomes extraordinarily hard to stay on message, if you like, stay on agenda in an organization that's open. It's an open organization. Many people have aspirations that you don't share, and you have to be able to deal with those in some fashion that still allows you to move the organization forward.
We have some participants who are actually working with ministries of education, whatever they're called in the various countries themselves. What would you say to them about leadership enactment in terms of if you're an education officer or if you're one of the people who are working on policy right now, who have signed on to the webinar today?
Well, I would say having a deep understanding of those folks in schools that you hope will be influenced by your work is a great starting point. And never forgetting what you used to know about that, because most of these education officers have been in school roles of some sort at one point in time. And I mean, your leverage on their practices, your leverage on their interests, I think, depend on you being able to acknowledge the circumstances they find themselves in, and to introduce efforts to change in ways that don't fly in the face of what you know their circumstances are like. So just remembering where you came from is the answer, I think.
That's good advice for all of us, isn't it? We have a second video question now, and this question is from Omar Meki. He's Vice President of the Norway School Leadership Association.
Hi Ken, my name is Omar Meki, and I'm the Vice President of the School Leader Association in Norway. In Norway, there has been a huge debate this year about teacher autonomy. My question today is, in your opinion, what is a sound balance between teacher autonomy and shared responsibility and collaboration within the school? And what should be the school leader's role and authority in managing this? Thank you very much.
Well, there's this. I guess the starting point is simply to acknowledge this idea of what it means to have professional autonomy, which is not the autonomy to do whatever you prefer in your role as an individual, but to engage in practices that your profession endorses as best practice. So with that as a kind of a starting point, it seems to me that there has to be considerable room for teacher autonomy in classrooms, because nobody is making decisions for teachers at the level teachers have to make their decisions. Any effort to do that in the past through scripted lessons and the like was doomed to failure right at the outset. The circumstances are just too unpredictable not to assume considerable autonomy about especially how those practices are enacted, how the goals that we might all agree on are accomplished in the classroom. I think there's an important distinction between ends and means here too. The ends of schooling are the responsibility of the public at large served by schools, and capturing the important goals for schools is something ministries and departments of education are responsible for doing. Now, there's certainly a level of goal about which only people in classrooms can make useful distinctions about, but the broad goals of education are certainly no exclusive purview of the profession. We're there to serve the public's image of what they hope their children will accomplish and be able to do at some point down the road. Looking at this from the point of view of a school leader, I would kind of forget that I had any formal authority in approaching this, and start from the point of view of trying to work with your staff as best you can, or with as many of your staff as you can, in collectively identifying what the best practices are, what the evidence available to us suggests would be the most effective way in accomplishing those goals that we've set as priorities for ourselves. And that understanding of best practice then serves as a kind of foundation on which staff can build, perhaps in an autonomous way then, encouraging people as a minimum not to violate that shared understanding of best practice, and to be creative about building on and adapting those best practices to best suit your own classroom circumstances. So, I mean, there is this evidence that teacher autonomy is associated with teacher effectiveness, but the question that was asked, I think, is the right one, and that is, where's the balance to be found, and how do we go about determining where there's an important and in fact, critical role for autonomy, and where individual autonomy simply is out of place?
The next question builds on the question that we've just heard, and it's about instructional leadership and what we mean or what evidence is telling us about instructional leadership and the extent to which it does contribute to student, teacher, and leadership improvement.
Well, the Ontario Leadership Framework is a description of what we know from the empirical evidence about good leadership practice. And in the blue document you referred to, the term instructional leadership is mentioned only once, and that is to dismiss it as a useful way of framing leadership, partly because of the earlier discussion we had of the distinction between management and leadership, and partly because the full array of issues that school leaders have to deal with goes far beyond the image of what leaders are to deal with captured in the phrase instructional leadership. I mean, that phrase started in the effective schools movement dating back to the 70s, which had a conception of good leadership, which is more or less sitting in the back of the classroom and observing and perhaps documenting what teachers were doing and providing them with feedback. Well, there's nothing wrong with a school leader getting their hands very dirty with issues of instruction with their staff, providing feedback where that's necessary. But there's so much more to the job than that. And in fact, as you and I know from the evidence we've been collecting in our LSA project, there are a good handful of school-level characteristics that have as big an effect on student achievement as classroom factors. And I'm speaking there of things like the academic emphasis that permeates the culture in the school, the disciplinary climate of the school, teachers' collective sense of efficacy, the trust teachers have in one another, their students, and their parents. All of those things have large impacts on the learning of students, sometimes through the effect they have on classroom practice, but sometimes quite directly on students, quite aside from classroom practice. Mm-hmm. So I like the term, I don't know, an integrated model of leadership, which is a term we use in the Ontario Leadership Framework. It integrates much of what instructional leadership models have to say, along with transformational models and some other things as well. I think it's important to be comprehensive in describing practices rather than limiting yourself to the subset of practices that particular models of leadership have to focus on.
Thank you. We have a third question from one of our participants. Now, Anonia Hunter is a Communication Relations Education Officer at the Ministry of Education in Jamaica. And this is Anonia here. We couldn't get a video, so I'm going to read Anonia's question. As a school supervisor, what are the 4 activities that should characterize school visits if the education officer wants to support schools in improving students' performance? A lot of times there's a focus on compliance to the Ministry of Education's requirements. However, I would like to fully understand what school activities directly influence students' learning. Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, we were just talking about some of them, I think, that are embedded in the culture of a school. If you use the term culture very, very broadly, And so the school activities that tend to encourage parents, students, and teachers, for example, to give the highest priority to the academic work in the school is one very important, if you like, activity that you might want to look at when you go into a school. How engaged in the academic work are the staff and students? You would hope fully, rather than being distracted by the sports program or other activities that are important addendums to the school, but don't represent the school's core work, at least as we view it. It's also important to look at whether student behavior in the school is a collective or individual responsibility. The idea of disciplinary climate really suggests it ought to be a collective responsibility. So when teachers see misbehavior in the hallway, they don't just close their classroom doors and assume that that's the job of the principal or the vice principal to look after. Similarly, they expect support in their classrooms from their school leaders as well. And the whole goal of that particular variable is to just maximize the amount of time devoted to teaching and learning and reduce the time that gets wasted in looking after misbehavior or other distractions to the teaching and learning in the school. One of the variables we didn't mention until just now has to do with instructional time. If I was in the role of being a supervisor in a school, I'd be very interested in just how much of the total time available in the school gets devoted to instruction and not to transitions or other things that lie outside teaching and learning. And when I was in the classroom, I'd be very concerned about how much of that designated instructional time is actually academically engaged time on the part of students. I mean, we have an enormous body of evidence from the international achievement studies now that looks at the relationship between opportunity to learn or instructional time and kids' achievement, and it's a strong relationship. And it makes perfect sense. People learn more of what they're spending more time on. Those would be three or four things that I'd want to look at in the school. There's I think a second part to this question though, and it has to do with how a supervisor from outside the school might work with the school leader when he or she visits. And I'm reminded of some recent research by Meredith Honig at the University of Washington, who was looking at how people in central offices in very large school districts in the United States, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and New York, began to build the instructional leadership capacities or the effective leadership capacities of their school level leaders. And it wasn't through providing formal professional development for them. It was getting to know those people and what perspective they were bringing to their job, first of all, beginning to understand how they understood their work. And then given a better appreciation of, in a sense, where their head was with that work, providing differentiated forms of support for them, forms of support that acknowledge, what the principal in this school is attempting to do and how they're thinking about the challenges they face are different than the person over here. And so providing that differentiated support in a kind of a personalized way was a second part of what they were doing. They were also, in a sense, brokering the principal's work by bringing them into contact with resources and ideas and people that now that they understand where they are, they believe might be helpful to them. And sometimes doing it in ways that help provide them with tools and rubrics and other very practical materials they can use with their staff to help them engage in instructional improvement work with them. So I think that approach to the role kind of eschews any sense that, I'm the ministry, I'm here to figure out whether or not you're doing what we want you to do. It's more or less saying, we're here to help you. And I think this is very consistent with the evolution of how effective districts are thinking about their work now. It is not, we're in charge here and you're carrying out our mandates. It's, we share a common understanding of what we're attempting to do, and we're here to help us. Tell us what you need. That's how I think that kind of supervisory role should be approached.
Mm-hmm. And the same with the principal and the teacher, I think,
Exactly.
in terms of the work that they're doing. You mentioned efficacy, collective efficacy of teachers, but I guess this applies to your school leaders, your system leaders as well. Could you just comment a little bit more about the importance of efficacy in our work that we do in schools?
Yeah. Well, there's really quite a lot of evidence about the effects of efficacy on a variety of interesting outcomes for people in many different roles, but certainly teachers and school leaders have been part of large research projects that have looked at what it is and how it influences their work. And I think the best explanation for why it's so important is that in the work of both school leaders and teachers, they will rarely be successful in trying to accomplish some significant thing the first time they try it. And efficacious people don't give up. It's very much linked to perseverance. But it's often defined as confidence. Confidence that you will eventually be able to persist and accomplish that goal. And and the confidence gives you the willingness to keep trying. People who lack efficacy, as the literature says, will often, when they fail the first time, say, well, that's just not how I work. It's not my style of teaching, or it's not the kind of leadership that I'm comfortable in exercising, and they'll go back to their own form of practice rather than giving the change enough time to percolate through their capacity system to eventually get it right and see the benefits of the change that they're trying to make.
Mm-hmm. And let's extend it to the idea of the family itself, and that relationship between the school community and the families themselves. How can our school leaders have an impact on the family variable?
Well, we're presently moving toward the end of a fairly significant project in the province, pretty much aimed at trying to answer that question. And we have 6 districts in the project working away at one or more of 3 goals that kind of answer the question. One of the goals is to increase parental expectations for their kids' success at school. These are parents who, for a variety of reasons they're not to blame for, may have unclear expectations or very low expectations for success, perhaps due to their own experience in school or whatever. We're also trying to help build parents' social capital as it pertains to school, which is help them with other like parents better understand the nature of schooling and how they can have an influence on that schooling. I mean, this is kind of rooted in an assets model of family culture, which is at its root is kind of a strong belief that every family has an important contribution to make to the development of their kids, if only we could recognize and build on what those assets are. And the third goal that many of these districts are working on is to help parents and kids in the home communicate more effectively about schooling and education. And all of these involve schools working in a variety of ways with individual or groups of parents to build those aspects of the family's culture, which are the alterable parts of the family. We know there's not much schools can do about the socioeconomic circumstances of parents and families, but there are a lot of alterable variables which we've referred to in our work as parts of the family educational culture that really can be changed. We've got a lot of evidence that that's the case. how we can go about doing that is the focus of the project I alluded to.
I look forward to reading that
Mm-hmm.
when it comes out. Another idea that you mentioned here, and I'm very interested in, is the idea of collective leadership.
Yes.
And what's its role in moving schools forward in terms of improvement and improving student learning and,
Mm-hmm.
well-being in the end?
Mm-hmm. A couple of points, I think, to start on that. The first one, I guess, is even though shared and distributed leadership seems to be kind of a focus in research and practice that's pretty current. There's always been shared leadership in schools. Schools could not run unless many people sort of took responsibility for getting things done, right? So in one sense, shared leadership just describes what's going on in almost all organizations. But there is this sense that if we could somehow further massage that leadership in some fashion, then it would lead to a kind of greater democratization of practice, perhaps. It would allow us to take more advantage of the collective capacities of the organization, which is probably a pretty important goal to shoot for. And in the long run, if it in fact unleashes some of those collective capacities, it should be better for kids in the long run. Now, this has been an extraordinarily complicated issue to burrow into from a research perspective, at least, because most of these claims are just that. They're claims. They're based on kind of a logical analysis of what greater distribution of leadership responsibility should accomplish in schools. But when we've tried to look closely and empirically at what the different forms of shared leadership amount to in terms of how the kids experience schools, we've found that this is a small body of evidence, but it's the only evidence available, that relatively unplanned forms of shared leadership do nothing for student achievement. They just sometimes confuse people. And in fact, some of the earliest literature on shared leadership came out of the private sector, and it was really an admonition to get rid of that stuff so that people could focus on the key organization's goals. I mean, we have a very, very different starting point for it now. But it really seems to require planned and carefully managed shared leadership in order to get the kind of impact for students that we want and we kind of assume is the case if we can develop this shared leadership well. I mean, otherwise you run the risk of kind of everyone being a leader, which sometimes is advocated. But in fact, that means many different goals, people going in many different directions, all exercising, autonomous responsibility in well-meaning ways, but not adding up to anything that is coherent for kids. So clearly, the idea of distributed leadership is a lot like collaboration, which is a good thing. But collaborating in a planned and meaningful way is, I think, the direction forward if we're going to see some impact for kids from it.
You've written about deep understanding. And so how would that, for principals working collectively or teachers working collectively, how would that idea of going deeper into practice perhaps be a way to look forward in that area?
Well, if you're linking that to shared leadership, then it seems to me the planful part of distributed leadership is to take on some responsibility as perhaps the formal leadership in the school for deepening everybody's understanding of what it means to deliver the leadership goods for folks. I mean, I think we can easily agree that at some point in time, almost anybody should be in a leadership role, should be kind of organizing and moving things forward. That's the position we've taken in the Ontario Leadership Framework. These are capacities that everybody should possess at the point at which they have leadership responsibility. It's not useful. This is my own view anyway. It's not useful to say everyone's a leader. It just denies the concept of leadership. You can't have leaders without followers. But we just have to be willing to sometimes be leaders and sometimes be followers, depending on the task and who's got the capacities to lead.
Now, one question that sometimes arises about the Ontario Leadership Framework is, does a framework such as this stifle the creativity and innovation of school leaders? We've taken the research of this document, and as you said, this is a summary of it, and it's very dense, and it's kind of a placemat in terms of picking out kind of the keywords that work within leadership practices.
Your question kind of goes back to the heart of what creativity means. And usually when people hear that word, they think of public creativity. That is, things people do that are viewed widely by the public as creative products of some sort of creative acts. And the people who are attributed creativity in the public realm like that, we should start by acknowledging, have mastered their craft, which is to say they are very good at the details of producing whatever products they have. And the creativity comes through kind of combinations, adaptations, and additions to the core technology of what they do, thinking of an artist. You know, the really creative artist also knows how to mix paint well, also knows how to deliver brush strokes with different depths. You know, really picky stuff, right? Kind of picky in the sense of the specific 21 practices in the leadership framework. And so being creative means kind of mastering a good chunk of that stuff and then seeing what you can do with it in your own context, seeing if you can engage in that kind of exemplary, innovative application of these kinds of skills, and some additions as well that really kind of take your work to the other level.
Ken, you and I have been in education a long time. Is this the best time to be in it? Is it the best of times, the worst of times? Where are we right now? If you look back over the years of your research and the work you're continuing to do now, how do you feel about where we are today in the world? Globally around leadership.
Well, I think actually, if we look broadly if I can start with the educational leadership community, the past 20 years have been sort of the golden age of educational research. When I think back to some of those earlier times we both lived through, there might have been an admonition to pay some attention to the research underlying our practice, but there wasn't much there to build on. And we've seen a tremendous change in that. So we can be evidence-based in a way that we never could before. Now, that seems to me to be quite parallel to how the evolution of medicine occurred in the early 1900s. I mean, it was a set of clinical practices with very little empirical evidence of the sort we now value underlying it. And it wasn't until there was a movement to put real evidence underneath those practices that the practice of medicine elevated to the status somewhat close to what it is today. And so it seems to me that we have more opportunities now to behave in ways that are known to be effective. And we need to take fewer risks in attempting practices that we now know have been taken off the table as not very effective. And so in that sense, I think it's the best of times.
And just look forward a few years down, just if we're looking at 10, 20 years, what do you look forward to in this work?
Well, I've no doubt that what we know will mature. There'll be a modest number of new ideas. But, mostly we don't see new ideas jumping out at us so much as well-known ideas being explored in more and more depth adapted slowly over time and gradually becoming something a little different. So I think that's kind of how our knowledge of leadership will evolve. It's probably 5 or 6 or 7 years, I think, before the Ontario Leadership Framework needs to be significantly revised. I think it's got a half-life of about that long. And, you know, the educational leadership community is not terribly prolific, which is to say, the research being done there, it has been slow to develop. It hasn't been as extensive as it has been in some other fields of practice. I think the research on instruction, certainly research on learning, have really had a lot more resources spent on them to get us where we are now than has leadership. But this is clearly something that's ramping up at the present time, I think. So I would expect we'll see significant extensions from where we are now within a 20-year period.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very good, and it sounds exciting as well. And I think it's probably a good spot for us to wrap up today. So thank you very much. It was I found it very interesting to ask you the questions, but also go deeper into your wisdom and your expertise around leadership itself. So thank you very much for joining us. And I know our participants would join me in thanking you as well. And it's been great to spend this time talking deeply about educational reform, about educational improvement, and the role of leadership in that. And we invite our participants to continue this conversation with the International School Leadership and our outstanding board of advisors, such as Ken and the others who I spoke about earlier. We have our website, we have the Twitter account, Facebook, and LinkedIn profiles as well. And finally, I'd like to close by wishing you all the best in your educational endeavors.